Hello everybody, it's Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and welcome to part 2 of the Breaking Chain tutorial series. As a series, it's actually a follow-up to a tutorial from a couple weeks ago where we broke a chain, but after I was done with that, I found some better techniques, and I wanted to get these out into the world, because I always want the best information out there. If I know a better way to do it, I want to share it. So as we saw in part 1, we made some nice, low poly, very clean, very accurate individual links that make for really nice chains that we can control. We don't have to do too many steps per frame. We don't have to bake it or make it editable. This part is going to be the actual breaking of a single link. It will plastically deform and maintain its shape while still being pretty strong and hopefully being indistinguishable from the other links that don't break. That is the goal. Let's jump into cinema and make it right away. Here's where we left off last time. I want to rescue a couple things from this scene file, not too much. We just want one of these cubes. In fact, I'm just going to rescue cube 1, which is one of the square ones, and the original rectangle. That's all we're taking. Copy those two. Control N or Command N to make a new file. Control or Command V to paste them, and there we are in a new scene file. Make them both visible, turn it on, click Reset PSR to zero them out, hit the letter S to zoom in, and we are ready to create our breaking link. So, how are we going to do this one? Well, it's going to start out similarly. Creating a cloner, place the cube inside of the cloner, change the cloner to mode object. The object will be the rectangle, but this time we're not going to do distribution count. We're going to do even, and that's going to put nice, clean, even spacing between all of the different links. Now, the fewer that we make, the quicker it'll run, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we have enough of these so that it can accurately break and deform and show the entire shape. The one thing I would like to do is make sure that the count is it centers right here, because I want to put a breakpoint right in the center. So I think that's going to work quite well for us right there. With that in mind, I think we're good to just make this editable, and we get all of our individual cubes. We'll be renaming them because we want to put them in order, which is going to be very important. So once again, the order is not quite what I want it to be. I just want to keep it clean. So this is going to become the first cube. That is the second one, third. I can't even think of a good way of doing that. Like, I've tried making it so the cloner flipped around, but it just never cooperated. So you know what? It's not going to take too long. I'm just going to go ahead and manually rearrange these until they are in the proper order. And it's just going to help keep everything nice and organized. I know it's not the most fun little detail, but it doesn't take that long. And we just want to be meticulous here. I'm just going to click on the top one and go down, 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 down. And you see we went all the way in the loop. The first object and the last object being opposite sides from the center point. I shall rename all of these back to their default name of cube, just fine. The first one will be renamed cube start. The last one will be named cube end. If you want to number them, you can. And that could help with the linking of the individual connectors. But for right now, I think that's working pretty well. All right, let's rename the cloner link snap. Actually, well, we can call it break. I just need to remember this properly. So this is link break, because it's going to be the breaking link. But we're going to be doing a lot of searching for objects as we go. So naming things properly is going to save us a lot of time as we continue moving forward. So link break, everything's reordered. Like I said, we're going to be nice and clean, very meticulous in the way that we build this, because we only ever have to do this one time, and then we never have to do it again. So doing it right the first time is going to be worth its weight in gold. Right-clicking on link break, we need a dynamics tag. Simulation, rigid body. This time, it is currently applying the tag to its children, and it's doing it to all of the children. I'm going to do this right now before we forget, and that is change individual elements to top level. It is applying these dynamic tags only to all of these directly. So excellent, this should be fine. If we hit play, they'll kind of fall down and slightly explode because they are slightly intersecting with each other right now. They're intersecting, and they're not a compound collision shape this time, so that's not surprising. One last change inside the dynamics tag for now. Let's change the collision shape from automatic to ellipsoid, so they're little spheres again. Nice and clean. Let's save this scene file. This will be number 3A because we're breaking the chain this time. To begin putting the links between them, we need a simulate dynamics connector. This connector will live as a child of the very first cube. We can click reset PSR, which will zero it out, and it's really big because of its default size. I don't want it to look quite so large. So under display, let's drop the draw size down to 2, which should be pretty small. You can enlarge it, but 2 is going to be pretty good for our purposes here. Now, currently, the default connector type is a hinge, but we don't want a hinge. I would like a fixed connector. Actually, no, let's start out with the ball and socket, actually. So I'm going to say, let's make this a ball and socket connection. That will link the first cube inside the connector, cube start, to the next one. Now here's where numbering them would be helpful because you'd be sure you did them correctly, but I'm just going to manually, very cleanly, make a copy of a connector and then link it to the parent and then the next one. And you have to be very careful here because if you mess it up, it's going to be hard to tell. And I'll show you how to check, but I'm just going to copy and do this on all of them. Now in the original tutorial, we had so many cubes that we actually did it in Xpresso rig to help speed this up, but there are so few here. We're making this so few connections overall that we can do this manually and it does not take that long. We don't need Xpresso for this setup, but we will be using Xpresso in some future parts of this tutorial in some pretty neat ways, actually, as a way of working around some limitations I found in cinema. This tutorial is the result of something like 30 hours of R&D trying to test things and get it working. I just really like this type of dynamics, so I was determined to get something working, and I am very happy that I did. All right, we're down to the last couple here. Drop that in there. One right there. Connect to the end. And of course, we need to put one in the end. That will link from the end, and that goes all the way back around to the start. So that actually creates a complete loop here. By default, a connector, and this is a ball and socket, is going to link one object to the next, and it's going to make them ignore collisions so they don't fly apart from each other. One thing we do need to do is let's rename these for one, and we need to reset their PSR. Currently, they are all called connectors, so we can hit this search bar, this little magnifying glass, and search for connect, and there they all are. You can easily select all of them. You see how they're all spread out, but if we click the reset PSR button, boop, they all jump into their individual spots, ready to rock. Very nice. And then I want to rename them by clicking on the basic tab and I don't know, let's name them pivot. Those will be the pivot point. Excellent. The search is no longer working because nothing's called that. Click X to clear that out. Now we see our entire chain again. In order to make sure that this is working, we need to just run the simulation. But if we hit play, it's just going to fall away. I think the best thing we might do is go and steal our static link from the previous scene file we were working from. We've already got these really nice static links, so clicking in there, I can go to one of my static links, copy it, open up a new file, close the new file, paste, reset PSR, and there we go. There's one of our links. I'm going to rotate it on P, laying flat, scoot it over. There we go. We got a link that's not going to move, and it's a good thing that we can use to test. Hit play, and this is going to fall down sort of like a bracelet. So that's working well. If you had something not working, if something was accidentally not quite linked properly, I'll intentionally break this right now. Make changes at time of 0 is a good idea. Let's intentionally link that to the same thing twice. You'll see that it'll open up. And when it's open up, you can go ahead, click on an object, and then see that should be the one that's broken. So rewind back to 0, grab that broken one, repair it. And then when you hit play, it should hopefully be working. Now, I want to explain the logic of what we're doing here. We're linking all these different pieces together, so they're free to rotate and pass by each other and be dynamic, working quite nicely. But of course, it's bouncing all over the place. This isn't behaving like a chain at all. It's behaving like a bracelet. So how do we actually make them be stuck where they currently are? Well, we need a second connector for every single one of these. And that second connector is actually, it should be pretty straightforward to make. I'm just going to duplicate the current pivot and be very careful and make sure you place it. Actually, you can move it up. It doesn't matter. The order doesn't matter here. So you can just move it up and it's a little bit easier to drop. I'm sure all of you have run into this where if you drag a copy up, it's pretty easy. But if you try and make it a copy below, there's a very tiny margin where it might not be a child or it It might or might not be. You have to be really careful. So dragging it above is just a little bit quicker. So duplicate, duplicate. I accidentally made 2 there. That's fine. Actually, let's be very careful with that. I'm going to delete both of those. Make sure you're only ever duplicating the one that you want. The one, and the one. Excellent. So we got all these different copies of pivot working just fine. Now I'm going to scroll through and select the bottom one of all of those, holding down Control or Command. So I got the bottom, the bottom, the bottom, the bottom, and just grab all of these. Keep in mind, I know we're doing a lot of work here, but we only have to do this one time, and then you'll have a forever breaking link. All right, we've got all the bottom pivots. Let's first of all rename these to plastic deform. So these will be our plastic deforming pieces. And they are not, go back to Object tab, they are not ball and sockets. These are fixed connectors. A fixed connector, of course, inside of Dynamics should just kind of lock these together. But they're not like a compound collision shape. There's still a little bit of flex in them. They can still move a little bit, and that's what we're counting on. In fact, the dynamics themselves count on that, and that's how braking force and braking torque works, is that they've kind of moved a little bit that they shouldn't have, and that's going to enable them to brake. Now, this is a good place to save it because we just did a lot of work, and we don't want to mess that up. 3B. So now we've got 2 different types of connections. They're both kind of doing a similar job, but these fixed connectors, which already should have gotten their information from the parent-child because we copied them from the existing one, if we hit play, this should pretty much look static. You see there's a little bit of wiggle on that. You see how it's still deforming a little bit, but it doesn't feel like a bracelet anymore. Now, that little bit of wiggle is what I was talking about. Even a fixed connector has a little bit of wiggle. Unfortunately, there is no setting to make that stronger. The only way to improve it is to change your global dynamic settings. So let's hit Control or Command D, and under Dynamics, under Expert, we can change our steps per frame. And that is essentially the only thing that will make that look more accurate. So keep in mind right now that little squishiness that we get in the beginning. And I'm going to jump this up to some amount. It's an arbitrary amount. I'm going to type in 44. I did tests at 44. They were working well. Different numbers here are going to result in needing to feed in different numbers when we try and calibrate this to break when we want it to. So just keep that in mind. If you have different, and there's good reason to have higher or lower numbers, but I'm going to work from 44 and it should be pretty good. Now, when this initially falls, look at how static this feels. It's not bending anymore. It's 40, it's from 5 up to 44 times more accurate than it used to be. Now, currently, these objects have a decent amount of friction. We can get rid of that friction, drop it down to whatever we want. Let's say 5, and you can see it'll slide down, and it's moving back and forth. Very clean, very fast running dynamics, even with jumping this up to 44. Now, all of this is working very well, but why did we put 2 sets of connectors between these? Well, we are going to be breaking our plastic deform, our fixed connectors. And let's see what will happen if we do that. We're going to be doing this a lot. I'm going to search for the word deform, and now all of those are going to pop up. So we can select plastic deform, and now I've got all of those selected. If we were to turn on some braking force or some braking torque, but let's stick with braking force right now, and we can put this up to some pretty high number. If you already watched the earlier tutorial, not part 1, but the earlier braking chain tutorial, you know that we have to put this up to crazy high numbers to make it work. So I'm going to jump this up to 55,000 right now, and that's probably still not high enough. But yeah, even that number is not high enough, because you'll see that by giving this a braking force, all these fixed connectors are breaking. Let's even frame by frame this and analyze it a little bit. Let's see what's happening. That is hitting, and the fixed connector is breaking its connection, and that one is breaking, and that one is breaking, and that one is breaking. But you can still see that these on the bottom, those didn't break. Those are maintaining their shape because not too much force was applied to them. But we have a second connector. We have this pivot point, which is saying that they can still rotate. So they're still connected, but they're not rigid anymore. So this is kind of a fun way that we can have the best of both worlds. Now, I did not want these to break so easily, so I'm going to add another 5 onto there. So now we're at 555,000. And I think that'll be enough to keep that it's not going to break now. But we need to build some sort of test for snapping this. So what's a good way to do that? I think we do this in a pretty straightforward way, and that is create a copy of our static link, scoot it onto the other side, and we'll keyframe this one. so that it's forcing this single link to break, and that'll be our testing scene. So the keyframe currently is on X, so it's starting out at 13. That's fine. Record there. And how long do I want it to take before that moves over? We'll keep it relatively slow, so we'll give it 45 frames. And then at 45 frames, this will have moved, I don't know, right around there. I'm even going to move a little bit further, more than we needed to. And when this starts stretching, I think that might come in handy. So at the time of 0, that should look good. If we hit play, it's going to start pulling. And then at a certain point, you see it snapped. And it didn't snap. What's happening is these have to be trying to match these two. The fixed connectors cannot keep them within that tolerance. And it just escapes. And then it's going to suddenly turn back into a bracelet because everything sort of broke. That's behaving as expected. And we can see that this is doing a good job of forcing it to stretch. Even with these high numbers, something has to give. So with this really good testing setup going, I think it's a good time to save the scene file again. Next up, we need this to be able to permanently break somewhere. And remember, we kind of said we wanted this top one, the first and last one, to be the one to break. And ultimately, those connections are made via this final cube. Now, keep in mind, this pivot, that never lets go. It's always connecting them. So you know what? I think that should be turned off entirely. That shouldn't even be on. In fact, I'm going to forget about it. So I'm going to rename it pivot dead. And that just means maybe we'll need it. But for now, I don't think we do. And then on top of that, well, actually, that's all we did. We turned that off. So as this stretches and breaks, all those other ones are going to snap. And then the pivot will take over. But now this one doesn't have a pivot to take over. So that should just snap and be loose. So let's see what happens. Let's hit play. Snap, and then that broke, and you can see this is loosely falling. And it's actually looking pretty good overall. It's actually, I'm kind of surprised, but it's working pretty well in general. What's happened is all of these did not break, so those are still looking stiff. Now, it did break in 1 or 2 spots down there. I'm going to give us a few more frames. So as I frame forward, you can see that swinging kind of wildly from that one pivot point, because it is now just one of our pivots, one of our ball and socket connections. So that's actually working surprisingly well. I think maybe 2 of them broke. But I mean, I don't think a chain would have this little floppy part that broke off the edge, even though the rest of it's working pretty well. So we need to try and get a little bit clever with how to fix that part of it. And in order to do that, I think we're going to need a little bit of Xpresso. And I'm kind of shocked that this works, but it does, and it's not that complicated. So we're going to step through this nice and easy. And even though there's not that much going on, so it shouldn't be too complicated. So if you haven't used Xpresso, this shouldn't be too bad. On our very bottom plastic deform, I'm going to right click, programming tags, Xpresso. We got our Xpresso window open. What do we want to do directly on this plastic deform? Well, we can do some pretty cool things. Dragging in the plastic deform, I want to get some information from it. Right click, new node, dynamics, dynamic connector state. There's actually a bunch of different things we do with dynamics, but right now, let's just use a dynamic connector state. This only wants one input, and that is what object. We can output from our plastic deform that is the object. So we'll say object, link those together. And now that we've done that, we can get a bunch of information from this. We can see that information from the output. And here's all the information we can get from it. But there's one that we really want, and that is broken. That is the broken state of this current object. That'll tell us if it hit that threshold and broke. So by creating an output of broken, we can get information. What do we want to do with that information? Well, I can't believe this works, but it does. I'm going to drag in the plastic deform again, so it's a second copy of that. And what I would like to do is control if this is turned on or off, like the enable, like turning on and off this enable. That enable on and off is actually the same as this property right here. You see as I turn it on and off, that turns on and off right there. That is what we want to control. So I can just drag enable onto plastic deform. And I want to control it via the broken. Now, once it's broken, that would be true. It's let's be very clear, especially if you're not too familiar with programming or Xpresso. This is going to be outputting a true or false statement. Is it true? And it's called broken. So it's saying, is it true that it's broken? So if it's broken, if it's true that it's broken, I want to turn off my object, which means we want the opposite of that. The opposite of that would be by creating what's called a not here. So we can find it by going into right click, Xpresso bool, and we can find the word not. You can also search for it right here, which we'll do with our next node. But I want essentially the opposite to happen. So if I connect that to the not, it's inverting true or false to the opposite and then feeding that into the plastic to form. Why are we doing this? The reason we are doing this is something I have found is if you turn a fixed connector off and then on, it will relink everything. It won't be broken. And this is the vital part. It will kind of work from the current place that it's at. So if this is bent and then you suddenly turn on a fixed connector, it's like, oh, that's where I'm supposed to be. Stay in this particular position and rotation. So we can use this to repeatedly break and then get fixed again, break and then get fixed again. Now, I didn't spend any time talking about it, but I had an earlier build where we were using a spring. We were using some springs, and the springs had some really great settings that were so nice. We didn't need any Xpresso, and it pushed everything apart. The problem is, and I should have set this up earlier, but the problem is there's a lot of things in dynamics that are springs, and I don't literally just mean this dynamic spring. I also mean things like in soft bodies and flexion and shear. Those are springs, and springs introduce energy into a scene. And what was happening if we used those springs is it was causing our object to start spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning faster and faster and faster and faster, and you don't have any control over that. Now, sometimes that already happens in dynamics, and there's not much you can do about it. There are some ways of mitigating it a little bit, but all of this is to stop that from happening. So what do we have now? We got something that breaks, turns itself off, and once it's turned off, it internally is like, well, I'm turned off, so I'm not broken, which means the next refresh of Xpresso, it's saying, are you broken? It's saying, no, I'm not broken. It says, oh, you're not broken? Turn back on again. So this is going to create a perfect loop of breaking, fixing, and repeating so it can break again if need be. Excellent. That's exactly what we want to have happen. The problem is that this is only on this particular plastic deform, and we need to make a copy of this onto every one of our different fixed connectors. But if we do that, if I copy it over, it is not going to automatically adapt to these nodes. It is going to be, if I make a copy, actually, I'll just do it. If I make a copy here, if I double click on that Xpresso, I'm now looking at that Xpresso. But if I select this plastic deform and say, hey, select that object, you're going to see that selecting this object here and not the one that it's on. So we need this Xpresso tag we don't want to manually relink it. So we need to make the Xpresso tag smart enough to automatically make that connection for us. So to begin, delete that top Xpresso. I didn't need it. We just want the bottom one. Double click. I am definitely inside of that one. Zoom out just a little bit. And I am going to drag in the Xpresso tag itself. And we need one node to make this work, and that is the hierarchy node. You can find it by right-clicking, but we can also click on the X pool, search for hierarchy, and there it is. Drag it in. And this doesn't need too much. I'm just going to feed it the object. The Xpresso object will go into the hierarchy object, so it knows that is the start point. Then there are these iteration paths where it's going to sort of repeat and check and do multiple things to multiple objects. We don't need that. So along those lines, taking start path and saying empty, just deleting all that information out. What this is now doing is just returning whatever object the tag happens to be on. So with that in mind, we can now output the hierarchy's current object into the plastic deform. So into the input, I will say that this plastic deform is the object of whatever the Xpresso node is on. We also need that to feed into the second plastic deform. So that will also input to object. And that is all that we need to do. That is the extent of the Xpresso for this setup. I'll rearrange those so they look a little bit cleaner. It doesn't actually change anything. That is our Xpresso. Awesome, very clean, very simple, and hopefully those concepts were pretty straightforward to follow. Now all we have to do is copy our plastic deform to everything. It'll be a little bit easier if I search for the word deform, and it's really easy now to copy this onto all of those, and they should be automatically updating and linking to their direct objects. Excellent. Now, before we test it, let's save it. 3D. Okay, moment of truth. Let's see what this does. And, oh, pretty good. That's pretty good. Let's let's analyze what's going on here a little bit. I have found if we frame by frame it, it looks a little bit different. So we just have to let it play and check out what's going on. Although I guess we can frame by frame it. You can see, hopefully what's happening is this is pulling apart and snapping and is constantly refixing itself. And as this bends and we hit these different thresholds, different parts are breaking. In this case, that one broke. But as soon as it broke, we go one frame further and it refixes itself. So that is now stuck. Remember before it was breaking, but it's flopping all over the place? Well, now it broke and then reactivated. So it could get broken again if we wanted to, but we are not at the position where that would break. So look at this broken chain now. Look at this link that is just, it is accurately broken. Technically, I don't think that we need this top one to relink again. Once it's broken, it's broken. So that's simple. We can just click on its own Xpresso tag and I'm going to click enable so it's off. So in case we still need it, we can go to it, but that is not calculating anymore. I don't think it's going to look too different. That will break, and it is now just free to swing and do whatever it needs to. I'm actually very, very happy with that. There's different thresholds we need to keep in mind, and there's a lot of settings we can tinker around with. Currently, we are just breaking this via the plastic deform. Whatever setting that is, that's where it breaks. We have a couple different things we could tinker with that specifically. The main one being is this bottom one is the one that breaks from the top to the bottom. It's the only one that's not going to get repaired. And in fact, now that I think about it, oh yeah, all those other ones are also set to a breaking force. So that's actually working really well. But we can keep in mind that this bottom one, which we can rename to, plastic deform main, that one doesn't have it reactivating, but we could change the force on that one so it's more likely to break or less likely to break. Currently, it's the exact same amount as all the other ones, but the idea of changing that to be quicker to break could be useful. But let's just do some more tests on this. It's actually working quite nicely, and let's make sure that it's not exploding and flying all over the place when it does finally break. I thought for that test, we could just make a floor, but let's put this inside of a giant sphere. Make a big old sphere. Actually, maybe not too big. We'll do that. Visually hide it, right? Double click, turn that off visually, right click on it, simulation, collider body, and the shape is automatic. I'm going to say it is a static mesh. So now there's just a big sphere. It's got a lot of bounce, a lot of friction. I'm going to say no bounce. In fact, let's put the friction pretty low, drop it down to 10. Our entire point in building this was to make a system that doesn't explode and go flying out in all these different directions. So let's make sure that that is actually what's happening. I'm not sure it's going to fall on the ground, but if we let that swing a little bit, no, it's not violent enough actually right now to fall on the ground. So we'll have to push it a little bit further, but that's working quite nicely. In order to push this a little bit further, let's increase our testing setup. Let's actually hit it a little bit harder by grabbing the static link. And actually this will be the static link animated. A little bit of a contradiction, but that's okay. Currently, the keyframes are transitioning over about 50 frames, but I can see that one little keyframe down there. If I drag that keyframe earlier, it's going to more quickly, thus more violently, break this apart. Let's hit play, and you can see it snaps it differently, and that time it does fall out and hits the ground. And we see it hit the bottom of the sphere, and it seems to be slowly, with very low friction, settling in. So, I didn't even think about it, but the link that we have here, I forgot the friction. Let's collapse that down. The friction, and there is really low. So 5% friction, very low. And it did eventually settle. But you see, there's no energy in the system. There's no spring trying to force it into a particular spot. So it's not spinning out of control. It took so long to figure out this workflow. Like I said, this is the end of something like, I'm not exaggerating, 20 hours of research. So hopefully this can be useful to other people. But look at that deformation. It's so nice. Now, depending on the scene, where we put it, what we tweak on it, you might need to make these stronger, make them, if you have a different steps per frame, if we crank up steps per frame. In fact, let's do that. Inside of Dynamics, I will Control D, go to Dynamics, and let's double this, go up to 88 steps per frame. And let's see what it looks like. You see a completely different simulation, still good. Let's drop it to 25. And okay, when I drop to 25, look, it's very different this time. What's happening is it's got less accuracy. So it didn't break them. It didn't hit the breaking threshold for these. So without hitting the breaking threshold, they never snapped. They didn't get to a new position. So it didn't maintain the shape. So we'd have to change where it breaks because we changed the steps per frame. 44 is working well for us, so I'll continue, but it was really important to mention that. Now we've got a single link. It's a good idea to really stress test this. Once we put it into the bigger context, the bigger scene file, I think we'll be able to see it. We'll tweak it in its final state there. But when I'm doing this type of thing, it is not unusual for me to make some copies of it. I'll make a second one of these, scoot it over there, make this static link, the one that's not animated, move it here, create a third link, lay this one flat. This is a link break, put that in the middle. So now there's 3 that are all capable of breaking, and that's static, and that's going to pull off to the side. Hopefully it's going to pull, yeah, it pulls far enough, and you see one of them broke quite nicely, in fact. So it breaks, swings, goes loose. Now, here's something to pay attention to, and it could be important later. I don't think we should compensate for it too much right now because the rig is working well, but just watch. Hopefully it does it well. Look at the shape of this right down there. As this does its little acrobatic somersault, you see it will collide with the invisible wall of the sphere. And when it does, it's enough force to break it again. So that breaks and then refixes and thus gets broken into another new shape. So currently it's not in a position that it's not stiff enough to survive that break. So maybe we'd want all of these to be stiffer. There are 3 different ones, but we named everything accurately. So if we search for deform, we're still going to get all of our nice deforms. In fact, deform's not the best word. Let's search for plastic. And now we get all of our plastic deforms. We can select all of them, and there is our final numbers. I could double the strength here by grabbing the first 5 and changing it to an 11, approximately doubling. Let's see if that is going to be stronger. Now, it still has to break, and it's a different simulation. So you see it's not particularly falling this time, but that's the one that happened to break in this instance. We can keep on changing it, and keep in mind, I mean, there's a lot of options here. We can change a lot of these different ones. We can randomize these, and we could use Xpresso to do it automatically. But if we were inclined, we could grab more of these and make their breaking threshold a lot lower. We can grab the plastic main, and remember, these are the end ones. We can make those a lot quicker to break. Those will break almost right away. So let's see what happens on that. Those will break right away, and almost instantly, you see, as soon as those are just those end ones, the ones where they break, as soon as that hits right there, that was small enough to break, and immediately those break, but there's still a lot of stiffness in the rest of it. So it's not immediately falling apart. Those are just the broken point. So now as this pulls, all those fixed connectors are trying to hold it until it will hit a snapping point. In fact, because of the way I just built this, that is not quite pulling far enough to break it all the way, and they all just stretch. But you see how robust this rig is. I'm actually quite pleased with it. So just for fun, we'll take our static link animated, grab that one keyframe, and move that further. It's only a single parameter, so we can just type in a bigger number and let that happen again. And that does pull enough for that one eventually to snap. And yeah, it's working quite nicely. And it is plastic deformation. So the way, what plastic deformation means, if you're not familiar, is if you have like a paper clip or something, it can bend a little bit, but if you bend it too much, that's its new permanent shape. And that's what we're doing here. If it bends enough, it'll hit that snap point and then break. Just to throw out some other options, you might want to stop where, maybe this is good enough. You don't need to go any further. But currently we are using a breaking force. We could do a breaking torque as well, which would be if it twists enough that will break. I've actually found from my tests that the breaking force works a little bit better, so I'm going to keep it there. But I am quite pleased with that. Before we move this into the main scene, let's put our final geometry on there, the tracer that will trace all of it. So delete these extra breaks, move the static link back there. So we're just dealing with one. We can clean that up. Save the scene file. A, B, C, D, E. Back to our previous scene file. We need to rescue this sweep because it's already doing a lot of work for us. Actually, we made that one editable. We want the one in the... No, we made them all editable, didn't we? Oh, well, that's not going to save us too much time, but we'll copy the sweep nonetheless. It's got a little bit of the parameters we want. Paste it in. What it doesn't have is a live tracer, so delete that tracer, create a new one. The new tracer can be made a child. Don't need the dynamics tag. What is this tracer supposed to be tracing? Well, we didn't have it selected in the beginning, so we can lock that and feed it inside of our link break. select cube start, cube end, and that's why we locked it, because now it's super simple to drag that in. Now we can unlock it and then go back to it. Very important to unlock, otherwise it's like, what's going on? Why is my interface working? Oh yeah, I locked it. Do that all the time. Currently tracing paths, we want to connect all elements. We don't want to trace the vertices. So now you can see we've got our final link there. This is a separate, it's built a little bit differently than our other one. So I might actually take our link break, which all zeroed out, centered very nicely. Selecting that, hitting Alt-G to put it into a null. Also name that one link break. However, we'll name this bottom one link break DNY for dynamics, and the sweep can live inside there as well. I'll make it after the object. So that shall sweep that, and that means we can just hide our dynamic object and we can see our final geometry on that link. We don't have to make it editable to change how smooth it looks. So clicking on the tracer, the type can be set to B-spline, intermediate points set to uniform. Drop that down to 1 or 2. It'll be pretty smooth there. We don't need it cranked up to 8. So 2 is pretty smooth there. Looking good. It's working. Two big caveats, two important things we have to talk about. One is the tracer visually lags 1 or 2 frames behind the dynamics. It's a pain to see in the viewport. Now I currently hid this object, but let's look at the dynamics as well. And when I hit play, you're going to see visually it is going to lag 1 frame behind. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, but right there you can clearly see it lagging 1 frame behind. Unfortunately, it's a refresh issue in Cinema. It's just inherent to the tracer. I'm not sure if it's like that's the way it has to be, or if it's something that could be one day fixed. I'm not sure. But a reason to be confident that this is okay is if I hit 1 frame forward, if I move my mouse around and if I mouse over the timeline here, it actually triggers a refresh, and you can see how it refreshes and jumps to the correct position without anything being clicked. So what that tells you usually is when you render this out, it is going to look correct. The actual final render will look great. It just won't look correct in the viewport. Just something we have to deal with. It's fine. Next problem is, of course, we've got this gap in the middle, and we need to fix that. It's not difficult, but it is specific. We're going to be cloning these, and I just know for a fact that cloners will delete nulls out. Cloners won't acknowledge nulls in the way that we want them to, so we can't put in dummy nulls. So we could put in some geometry, but something that we found doing testing earlier is something that could be handy is we can just put in an empty connector, and that will work quite well. So selecting this cube start, holding down shift so it automatically becomes a child, I can create a simulate dynamics connector. That is automatically made a child. It's automatically zeroed out. And we can set it to fixed if we want to. None of this is meaning anything because we're not going to link any objects to it. Taking that and moving it into the center point, I could eyeball it. We can also set this to world and type in 0 on X, and it should be dead center. And then we go back to relative because I don't want it to be on world. This will be, I'll just call it start. That's the start one. Creating a copy of that and holding on Control or Command, drag that into end. That is copied it into the end in the exact same location. Rename that one end. And then in the tracer inside the sweep, we can add those in. So before the cube start will just be this start, and immediately see it jumps to that one. And after the end, we'll drag in this end. And those are just empty connectors, creating the proper position. It refreshes, and you can see that's looping all the way around perfectly there. If you want to, you can scoot one a little bit over and get a little bit of a gap in there if you want to, but I think lined up there should work perfectly fine. If we leave that hidden, it's still going to lag that frame behind. We should be able to play, and you'll see it break. Because it's smoothed out, we get that nice bend happening in right there. The snap happens. There's those couple of frames where this is stretching and then finally gives way. So I think all that is just working really well. I'm quite pleased with that. As a rig, it's robust. There's a little bit of Xpresso, but I think the concept is pretty straightforward. So I am quite pleased with this overall. That link is ready to be integrated into our other family of links. So one last save here in our testing scene in case we need to come back to it. And now copying link break into our previous scene file. We already have all this nice fun stuff happening, so let's start integrating this as well. I think it'd be nice to simplify a little bit. There's a lot going on here. So just to be really clean, here's a whole chain, which is getting cloned a lot. Let's turn off that cloner so we see a single chain. Inside of there is a cloner of a link. So that is our single link. And these are kind of an animated link. And if we want to, we could rename that link dynamic. So those are animated dynamic links. That's a static link. And now we can paste in our link break, and that can start living with other things as well. Now we can integrate this in a lot of different ways. Let me show you a simple way of doing it. Well, a semi-simple way of doing it. One would be, we can put this in a specific spot if we want to. We could just put it on the end right there and let it break at that spot. But I'm thinking we've got this static link and this creating a bunch of clones. What if we make this not have quite as many copies? Then inside of this entire hierarchy, this chain, put in our link break, reset PSR just to zero it out, scoot it right there. So that will be the broken one. I would like it to be its own unique color just to stand out. So let's make it bright white. Let's stand out a little bit so we can see which one it is. And then because there's a gap here, I want a second copy of cloner link. And that one can scoot over and continue the entire sequence. Now you will see that this is not rotated properly, really straightforward. That cloner can rotate. At this point, you should think of these as like individual Lego bricks or like an erector set. You can build whatever you want from it now. So keeping it clean, always keeping those original references as you need them. It's going to be very, very useful. Now, let's just do this step by step. We've got this sphere and it's got a bunch of copies. I want a relatively simple version of this to start out with. So in order for it to run relatively quickly, let's just start out with there being 2. On the sphere, there's currently all these hooks. I just want there to be 2 hooks. Of course, they're on the wrong sides. Actually, when you turn on this cloner, they'll be correct. So one step at a time. Grab the cloner chain. Actually, that's pivoting from, I think it is actually in the correct spot. Hopefully it's correct. Turning on our cloner chain is going to create a bunch of them. We don't want the random right now. That's making them rotate all over the place. And cloner chain, we just want 2 of them. Drop it down to 2. Those are now perfectly correctly placed. If they're not offset in the correct position, keep in mind you just go into your cloner chain and change the radius, making sure that those are in the correct spot. Now, this is just 2 chains. So I'm thinking that the sphere is probably too heavy to properly hold it. And you never know what's going to happen. So I think it's a good idea to name this again 3G. Now, here's a slightly unfortunate thing, and I just haven't found a way around it. Cloners work really well when it comes to dynamics, but they can't handle Xpresso. And we need Xpresso to turn all of our connectors back on when they need to be. So we do have to make the top level editable every time we want to run the simulation, but we don't have to bake anything this time. We don't have to swap anything. And that's why this is an improved technique. So in this case, I can hit letter C, make that editable. And now there's 2 chains with their own dynamic copies set up. I wouldn't be surprised if something goes wrong, but let's see how this runs. And, okay. Remember I said that these are going to lag behind, and you can see it really blatantly here. You look how far those fall behind. So I tend not to want to see those in the viewport. I want to see the original one. So anytime we make a change, keep in mind we should undo, go back to our uneditable version, and now we can really easily go in here, see the original dynamics, hide, or even turn off the sweep. So now you can see we get the dots, and at least it will show up accurately in the viewport. So again, make it editable, hit play, and now you can see accurately those connect, and we can see them break, and actually working really well out of the gate. Look, they are deformed. They are broken into this C shape instead of being a complete curve. So actually that worked pretty well out of the gate. If they're not actually, well, it depends on the frame we're at. If I let it play a little bit further, you can see they seem to be trying to close a little bit. They do seem to close a little bit. So maybe they didn't quite hit that plastic breaking point, and different settings are going to affect in different ways. In fact, probably the culprit here is in this scene file, our steps per frame are set to 25, and we built this and calibrated it at 44. So going back to 44, let's see if those will better plastically deform. And yes, at 44, those settings are good. And you can see we get the C shape again, and it's snapping. That is working exactly as we wanted it to. So now now it comes into the different settings you need to make, essentially turn this into the playground that you want it to be. We can make these more or less likely to snap via creating, increasing their plastic deform. And also the sphere right now is very heavy. So we got a lot to test. I'll start with the big sphere in the center. Let's make it a lot lighter still. This is getting cartoonishly light, but who cares how heavy it is depending on what we're doing. In this case, it doesn't matter. So with it being very light, let's see if it's enough to hold. No, these immediately still break. So those are nowhere near strong enough to hold. That's not super surprising. Oh, another thing. I'm going to probably forget a couple times. I'm sure you will too. That's why it's super important to save. I have to remember to undo back to our chain, our cloner, before we make it editable. Otherwise, it's just not gonna, it's gonna break. It's gonna break. So we'll make this really light again, 0.01, because I had to undo those. And let's search for the word plastic. And there's all of our plastic deforms. And remember, and I actually kind of forgot about this, remember we made the main one break really easily. So to start out with, I'm just going to put that back to the same 555,000 that all of them are at. Actually, they're not all at that. Some of those are way stronger still. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to grab just one of the original plastic deforms. We had these different numbers that were working well. I'm going to copy that number into that one. So they all break at the same weight. Excellent. That is the singular change I made right there. I still have them selected so I can make, well, I'll lose the selection in a moment because now we need to test it, make it editable. Hit play, and let's see if it holds on a little bit better. Oh, yeah. Well, you see, it did hold on better. It held on for that moment, and then finally snapped, which is, depending on what you're doing, exactly what you want. But those were not quite strong enough to hold on all the way. Hit undo, search for deform again. Actually, now search for plastic again, because other things have the letter DE, so PL gets where we want quicker. Just as a little side note there, I'm going to double the strength, just add a 2 instead of a 1 at the beginning. Make it editable. Hit play. Okay, still not quite holding. I mean, you can see it's trying. There's a lot of force there, but it's trying to hold on. So we can just keep on increasing those numbers. PL, and I have no idea what number we want here, so this is fine. I'm going to jump it up more than double, turning the 2 into a 5. Make it editable. Let it run. Okay, there we go. Now, that was now strong enough that that didn't immediately break. Keep in mind, it's a big balancing act. We don't, well, this still has that vibrate tag on there, so this is still going to be trying to yank around. So who knows where, and see, it did yank that enough for that to snap, and it pulled it out, but it was a little tricky because the plastic deformation, and I'm kind of glad. We're just going to play around here for a little bit to find the methods to calibrate this, because there's a lot going on. That was enough to pull it apart and snap it, but our deformation there is too strong. It's so strong that it's never breaking. It can't hit that threshold and break. So instead of making that weaker, we probably need to make other things lighter, or possibly make that link heavier. I'm not sure. There's a lot to play around with there. So we can, again, hit undo and then search for plastic, grab all those. Now we cranked that up really high, which is nice, but it went beyond the point where that could break. So this is still probably too heavy. I'm going to drop it back down to 2 because it was still doing nice deformation there. And with it down at 2, maybe, I mean, the sphere's still so much bigger in volume than the rest of them. Although, actually, now that I look at it, those are not deforming properly. We've pushed it to the point where they don't want to deform based on the current settings. So with that in mind, putting it back to 1, which was the original number. Actually, I'm going to undo, well, don't want to lose everybody. I'm going to go back to 2. I forgot to make it editable. If you don't make it editable, the Xpresso's not running, in which case we wouldn't see it break and deform. So just checking it here. Okay, indeed, it did not deform. So I can hit undo and search for plastic. PL. That's why we named these. Really easy to go and search for those. So we'll go back to the original 1 there, which was just the number we calibrated, we knew looked good. So if we hit editable, those should hopefully break and still look like they're deforming. Yeah, so we're at the point where they're deforming nicely, plastic deformation, and we just need to make things lighter until it's enough to hold. Now the density is, in theory, pretty light there. But like I said, like the volume of that as compared to the volume of one of these links is going to be cartoonish. Now, even these chains could have a lot of weight to them. So we need to figure out how long the chain is how much weight is on it in total, and kind of just stop that from yanking as hard as they are. Give it a save so we can do some more testing. H. Okay, I just had a thought. This is an important one, but we've been lowering the density on this big sphere. But an alternative thing that we could do is increase. Oh, I should have to. Oh, looks like I slightly just messed something up because I saved the file and then reverted. And I saved it when the chain was broken. So, you know what? I guess it's worth, I could go back and fix this off camera, but let's go ahead and fix it on camera. These are 2 copies of the same chain. So we can just delete the copy and we just have to rebuild this cloner. So if you do accidentally go to the point where you push things too far, it's not quite working, then you just have to rebuild your cloner and just take the top level chain and everything should continue to work just fine. In fact, now I think about it, this cloner is pretty much the same settings. So if we make a duplicate of that chain, we can put this chain 0, as it's now named, into that. And that should pretty much bring us back to where we were. And it might be a good idea to get rid of the 0 so it doesn't start stacking numbers. But it was as simple as that to rebuild it. Otherwise, you'd have to just make your cloner, set it to radial, give it this radius and the count of 2, and you would be back. So even I make those mistakes, so no problem there. Hit the or hit save, so it's saved to the next version. And let's talk about a possible fix here. So just recapping, those are snapping really quickly, even though that one did a good job of holding on for a while. So let's say we really don't want those to break and we can't lower the weight of that down anymore. Something we can do to counter that is go into our link break dynamics, link break dyne, click on its dynamics tag and change its mass to be heavier. If you start making that stronger, those become heavier and it has more influence over what is around it. In that case, giving this a custom density of, let's try 2. I'll double it. I don't think it'll be quite enough. Still snaps. That one's holding on better. Actually, yeah, you see that one did not break. And this one did break, but you see it deformed. So that means we're maybe on the right track and right in the ballpark. Set that to 3, hit play. Oh, I didn't make it editable. Gotta remember to do that. Otherwise, we can't trust what we're seeing. Okay, at 3, you see nothing else changed. I just made those have a density of 3, and this is now holding on tight enough that it can't escape. So if we do that properly, then we should have a lot of influence over exactly how this is going to move and snap. We do have that as another control. Changing the density of these individual links, specifically the snapping one, is going to give us more control. Excellent. By almost accident, this final, because of the way we copied it in, this final link is not rotated to the proper orientation. I'm kind of surprised that it is able to handle it. I'm going to undo to get back to our proper chain, and I think actually that's the meat of this. This covers most of it. Let's try pushing it just by making some more copies, because why not? And it will force this sphere to start wiggling around a lot more, and even set up a render just to see this all the way through so we can see all of the links working properly. But yeah, that should work. Let's begin by fixing this link right there, the way those are in. We can turn those, I mean, we can do this real easily by grabbing where they're getting fed into that sphere, transforming that. Currently it's 90 degrees. Rotate there. Now that's a proper orientation, working just fine. And selecting both of them, we can create as many clones around as we want to. 8's a nice fun number. I like that. So we want that to fall via gravity and then start shaking more and more and more and more until hopefully it breaks. So with that in mind, why don't we start increasing the force that is put upon the big sphere in the center? Currently it's at follow position 5, which is actually quite low. In the beginning, let's say it's at 0. So at the time of 0, it'll be 0. And then at the time of, I don't know what, let's say, well, let's just keep it going. 300 might be too much, but let's push it to a really high follow position by that time. So it'll probably happen earlier, but it's going to keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And as it's stronger and it's kind of yanking in a particular random way, it's going to become more likely to break the links. Now, this should all be working properly and we're going to be rendering it out. So I think we're in a good position to view the geometry, the final geometry in the breaking link. We can hide the not breaking geometry. Of course, they're still different colors, but that's good for troubleshooting. So I don't mind leaving them on different colors right now. doing that, we can, yeah, I think, oh, let's set up our render settings. Controller Command B. There's our render settings set up for Instagram resolution 1080. Although I will cut that in half, divide it by 2. Save. I'm not going to save anywhere directly, and make sure it's aiming for all frames. I'll stop it when it's ready. Frame this up with our new square distribution. If you want to, we've still got that random factor. You can turn that back on and have these randomly. Oh, it's because we copied this and it's a new copy. We have to drag random back in again. But we could pivot. Rewind to 0. Very important and possibly dangerous if you did it wrong. Go to 0, and now we can set up a rotation. Apparently the angle changed, so this is we need to change this to H because of what we did. But now you can see they're pivoting up and down if you want to. I don't particularly. It turns out when that one accidentally rotated, it was because I rotated this one by accident from when I copied one cloner to the other. So a little troubleshooting there, but once again, this is the goal here, and this is always a goal in any tutorial I make. And honestly, if any tutorial you watch anywhere, don't make exactly what the person in the tutorial is making. Make it your own. How are you going to make chains and do something unique? How are you going to take breaking chains and do something unique with them? This is the way I make tutorials, is like pure raw technique. I tend not to try and make things pretty. Other people make things look pretty. I'm talking about the technical side of things. How do you make it work? And that is the goal here. So at the end of this tutorial, hopefully you know how they work. With all that said, this is ready to go. I can hit save, make this chain editable, and deselect everything. It didn't set up any nice looking render settings, but here is, I guess we need some sort of background because they are shiny. So throwing in some sort of HDR or sky would be a good idea. We could just make them, I don't want to worry about making that right now. So I'm just going to make them not reflective, and they can just be a darker gray color. Good enough. Because once again, we're just testing things. And that green's a little strong. Let's make it darker. It'll look a little bit nicer. Aha. Excellent. I shouldn't have made those changes while it was editable, but that's fine. Send that to the picture viewer and let this start chugging away on all the frames. And even while that's going, I can hit undo. All the colors were fixed, but not when I made this editable. I mean, I wish there was a way around not having to make this editable, but if you're running Xpresso, you got to make it editable. So I'll fix these colors back up again. Okay, that only took 6 minutes. The dynamics run relatively quickly. Hitting play, we can see how this runs. Very nice. One chain breaks right away. The rest are holding. And then it shakes, it's getting heavier, and it hits hard enough where it's some break. And once one breaks, then it's kind of a cascade effect. The rest can't quite hold on to it. So you see how they each individually break. Now, watching this, I noticed that there's kind of a bad vibration happening here in the center. You can see it when it's running. You see how these middle ones are like, oh, maybe in the center. Let me rewind. You see right there, it's like jitter, 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 jitter. It's like, what's causing that? Because you see it's very stable on these other static ones. So I just did a little bit of exploring. And I think that the problem is actually in this thing I had never done before, which is we copied all of these links to be part of that static mesh. And remember, those are the extra geometry that's running on these works really well. But in this case, this cloner is breaking that effect. And you see how we put this dynamics tag on the static link so that this gets ignored? It's not getting ignored. So let me just show you in the simple form what's happening. Here's the problem. If I drop this count down to 2, make that editable. If I were to hit play, you're going to see that it's going to fall. And look, these are not correctly shooting outward. Like they're trapped near the body of the sphere instead of being able to go out to the end of that. So I was just trying to figure out what that is. So let me show you a little bit of troubleshooting. If I go inside of this, there's this sweep that has the invisible, well, the turned off dynamics tag on it. And actually, to make it a ghost, maybe that would do something. That'd be great. No, I tried. There's a new idea. Trying to make a ghost. Still not working. So, but you'll see if I delete that entirely, so we don't see it anymore. But watch. When I hit play, do you see how that shoots out? And it's where the ring actually should be. So that shows us that that sweep was the problem. Now, I'm going to hit undo because I want to bring back my cloner before I accidentally break it. And so what that means is, actually, we should be able to just turn off the cloner and then test this on 1. We'll see if that works. No, it's not dynamic. We'll have to make it editable, but let's make the fix. Let's not get too lost here. The sweep is the problem. So what I'm thinking is let's create a copy of that chain. And on one of them, all of the dynamics gets deleted. And that can move up and become the dynamic object. And in the other one, the sweep gets deleted. So one has a sweep and the other has the dynamic objects that should be collided with. So having done that, make our chains, just two of them editable. We'll be real quick in the viewport, hit play. And now, bing, you see they pop out to the correct spot. We still see the chain. It's still got the correct number of copies, but it's not jittering in the center point. So that's just a little bit of quick troubleshooting. Once again, we're just playing around, trying to figure out the extra details. This is actually holding that together really well, considering that there's only two chains holding it. And I think if it pulls hard enough that these, will break. Yep, boom, that one broke. This one's still holding on. Of course, in the viewport, we don't see the those lag behind, but that does a very nice job of breaking. Quite happy with that. There is just one last thing I would like to do. One last thing I would like to show you for playing around and trying to make extra detail. And this is it's not too fancy. It's actually a very simple concept, but I think it's really powerful in the potential execution of it. So let's set ourselves up well, hit undo, bring this back, save it as a new scene file. Of course, if you are on Patreon, you can get access to these. HI. Here is the thought. Currently, that is randomly, well, it's not randomly. It is just creating our broken link, the link that can break, in the center point here. We just manually said, hey, that's where that goes. What if we wanted this to be randomly placed? Well, there's two different methods, but I'm going to go right to the slightly more advanced method, but it's definitely way more controllable. And here's the thought. It's actually pretty fun. I like this a lot. We are currently copying that chain, and inside of it, we've got a long series of links, and we've got a breaking one and a static one. Let's just treat these as a palette. These are just raw resources we have to play with. So grabbing one of our dynamic links, our breaking link, and our static link, I'm going to pull those entirely out, and we don't need anything else from that chain. Hit delete. There's nothing else. We just have these three raw ingredients. Very nice. Now we can create a series of polygons that we could clone onto and let it randomly decide which one gets applied. How are we going to do that? Well, let's begin visually by creating a single plane, set it to 1 by 1 as far as height and width segments are concerned, a height of 10, a width of 20. We know that's the way it was built. Putting that inside of a cloner. Let's create a brand new cloner. Why not? Cloner. And set that to linear. Currently it's pushing out on Y. I don't want Y. I want it on X, I believe. Let's create more. And we can see exactly what it is doing. I'm not sure what kind of spacing we need, so let's do the same alternating. I'm going to alternate on P by 90 degrees, and we can see those, but there's definitely not enough spacing. Let's start increasing that. I think we can eyeball this pretty well as far as like where the chains will be, because these are just representing where the chains will be. We can make as many clones of that as we want to. Very, very clean. Dropping that inside of the second cloner, the chain one, this is going to create a copy, copies of them spinning around. So make as many of those as I want. Let's, in this case, let's make 3. We can change the radius. Looks like they're spinning the opposite direction I want them to. So 2 things we could do. We could do a transform. Actually, these transforms are already out of whack because we're using old cloners. Turning those off, this will be pretty easy to spin that positive 90 degrees. And now you can see we've got these nice empty polygons flaring out. Make as many of those as we want. So we have 2 different cloners. One that will make as many copies as we need to, pushing in and out. And a second one that will make however many we want spinning around. Very nice. Set this radius to whatever is useful. Right around there is what I'm thinking would be best. So that is geometry. That's something we can clone onto. This cloner chain, let's call this, this is the radial. So we'll call that radial. This one, name linear. That's not how you spell linear. EA. Put the radial cloner into a connect object It's welding right now, but we don't need it to weld. So there's a connect in there. That's all a single piece of geometry. So creating a brand new cloner that can store our links. Specifically, I want it to hold breaking links and dynamic links. Put those both in. And I think I'm going to make the dynamic one above, and the break will be the second one. That'll become important in a moment. We want to clone onto something. What do we want to clone onto? We want to clone onto an object. The object will be that connect. Let's name that empty chain connect. So this is currently cloning onto the surface. I want it to clone onto polygon center, and instantly, very nicely, it is creating exactly one link per polygon we were just seeing. Now, we are seeing everything's the same color. We need to apply the gray material onto our regular link, and we can see that it's actually alternating broken, like not broken, 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 not broken. So that's fine. That works well. We want to control exactly where those are being placed. We can do that via changing this. Well, right now the mode is set to iterate, but we have different modes we can set it to, something like random or blend. We can't do blend, but it is currently iterating between those. I think, I forget which modes. We'll just have to test it. I'm going to create a let's create an effector. In this case, I'm going to make a plane effector. The plane effector is pushing things all over the place, but I don't want them to push things. I'm going to turn that off. What I do want to do is affect the modify clone under parameter. As I increase this, the instant I do, you're going to see everything is going to turn into a regular link. But if I crank it up all the way, you're going to see all of them. Actually, I think if we just go beyond the 50% mark, because there's 2 in there, as soon as we go past the 50% mark, they all turn into breaking links. So if we put that up all the way, we can control how this gets applied by controlling things inside the fall off. For instance, if we make a random field, you can see that via just this random field, we can decide where they're getting placed. They're randomly one type or the other, and we didn't need to make this layer editable or do Xpresso to control random seeds. They're each being controlled separately there. You have a lot of additional control inside the remapping. You could influence it to be more one type or the other. The one I like doing is turning on the contour mode, turning on curve and scooting this up or down. You can see really what we want is just a light sprinkle of these breaking ones, because we don't want them all breaking. There's a lot more geometry. There's Xpresso, there's connectors. They just run slower. We don't want them. We want as few breaking ones as possible. If you wanted, they could all be breaking, but I think this is a good way of optimizing. So dragging this along, getting the proper proportion going, I think you'd want to make sure, depending on what you're doing, make sure that every single one of them has a breaking one, because otherwise that one will never break. But of course, this is random, so you could go through, click on the field tab of the random field and keep on cycling through until you get one where most, see everything has a 1 or 2, in that case, 3 different ones that can break. It's acceptable. That could work. I do like that, and I've used that method before. But a slightly better method, I think, would be deleting that as what we're inputting into the plane, and let's input something else. In this case, an end side. I'm going to flatten down this end side, hit T for scale, and we can shrink it to something around, let's say, the middle. And this is pretty cool. Inside the plane, in the fall off, I will drag our end side. It's going to look a little bit crazy in the beginning because by default, that is calculating based on a long, but if we change it to calculate based on the radius, it's creating essentially a radius around that shape that is a thickness of 10 units. If we increase it enough, you're going to see, there we go, right around there, enough that we get we get exactly 1 on every link, but we don't get more than 1. So anywhere that this line is intersecting at the beginning, that is where that clone is being created. So if that is what's happening, all we have to do is create or deform this end side. So I'm going to create some extra sides on there. Let's say 24. They're all in the exact same spot. Hit T for scale, put it right around the middle point. If I make some sort of deformer, in this case, actually really straightforward, as a child of the inside, I will feed it a random effector. This random effector will treat it as the random effector itself will be a deformer, deforming points. You see immediately it's going to kind of explode. It is deforming on X, Y, and Z. I don't want it on Y. Zero that out. Now they're all on X and Z. We don't need that to go too far. So we can lower that down. In fact, if we just leave it on Z, they all randomly push in and out. And because it's a random effector, it's both positive and negative. So based on this, I can increase or decrease how far this can push. And it should be creating pretty much exactly one. If I put the thickness correctly, it's going to create exactly one link in between each one of those. And in fact, it'll be super clean. I've got a lot of points on there. It'll be super clean if I make exactly as many points around as there are end sides. Or, I'm sorry, as there are arms here. I'm not sure how many arms there are. There are 10. So if I set this end side to 10, then there should be pretty much 1 point per, and it can't do all that overlapping. And I don't know, I think it's just a really fun technique where you have this control and the ability to choose exactly one that is going to break. And if you can see right here that if it hits the right angle, that it is getting 2. So I just didn't calibrate the radius correctly. So I can decrease that until you see just the 1 is grabbed, and that is working very, very nicely. A lot of power there. There's that this is putting an end side, but I can think of additional ways. Just one more, just for fun. Get rid of the end side. Create a matrix, and this matrix object. Oh man, there's so many different combinations. Everything, I'm getting overwhelmed by all the different ideas I'm having. We can set that to radial as we are on everything else. That radial can be set to 10. A radius, we can set the base radius right to the center, like right where they begin. And then now feeding that a random effector, another MoGraph random. Currently it's pushing on positive and negative. I only want to go positive. So we'll say 0 to 1. And then under parameters, I want no X, no Y, but now it's just Z. So as I increase Z, you see I have exactly one matrix object per, and that becomes the new source inside of the plane, which is actually doing the switching from one type to another. It's not going to be fed the spline. It will be fed this matrix object as a point object, and that has its own little radius, which we have direct control over. I can drag that down. Now I have exactly one link perfectly randomly distributed on the entire thing. That becomes the starting point of it. I'm going to group all these together just because they're all sort of related. And that's working quite nicely. I can hide this. We can see exactly the 1, well, in that case 2. I guess I, once again, need to shrink my radius just a little bit. There we go. Exactly one breaking link in a random position around it. And that by itself is ready to, there was another 2. Just got to get that radius correct. And then the one thing I don't have is anchor points on the end. So these are all just loosely hanging there. In this case, I would probably just create a second cloner. Let's just do another radial. And this radial can contain our static link. Bing. And that can increase the radius. Transform, not 90. Oh, yes, 90 and a 90. There we go. So now we've got static links. We've got these dynamically generating exactly wherever we want them to. Very nice automatically. And then we just need the sphere in the center to be able to have as many as it wants. I've, even as I was just talking, I just thought of an additional way to do it. I'm not going to make it because we got to stop at a certain point. But let's make sure that this also has 10 copies. So it should create 10 links all the way around. You see, I selected both of these. And we could, keep in mind, we can just select all of those and change the counts at the same time. This could drop down to 2. It could jump up to 22. We can put anything we want there and make it as crazy as we want. But I'm quite happy with, actually, we'd also want to grab the matrix and to change the count with that. That is pretty much what I want to do there. Now, if we're going to run this, if we're going to play or run the simulation, we do have to, well, let's save it because, hey, that's a good setup. So what's this center ring? Oh, that's what we were using earlier. We don't need that anymore. Delete that. And this random, get rid of that. We're cleaning things up a little bit. The original rectangle, don't need that. Excellent, very clean. So yeah, there we go. If I want to run this, make sure that your empty polygons are not going to render, even if you do want to see them. And then right when you want to render, just make sure that we take whichever one is actually cloning all of the chains, which is this main one. We can call that main links cloner. That's the one we need to make editable. So save, make editable, it's ready to rock. We should be able to send that right to the picture viewer. Continue without rendering. Excellent. I'm not going to make it, but just to throw out another idea, because I could just keep going and going and going forever, would be creating all these little copies and links. We could, in theory, create a like a straight spline, like a helix, a straight helix on the surface of this and generate a bunch of straight lines. And then based on those straight lines being generated randomly on the object, that could be getting fed our alternating planes. And then we could clone everything onto that, so we could get all these cool arbitrary angles, or even if it could be a character, it could be a face or a character, where each of those would be cloning onto, and probably not an animated character. Then you have to link it manually. We're trying to make this automatic one, but you could copy a bunch of these and they'd be in arbitrary directions, and they wouldn't have to be spherical. It'd be on the surface, and it'd automatically create all of the different links coming out from it. So that will wrap up my technical part of this. Let's just let this render. All right, this is still rendering, and I'm not quite done with it, and it's looking really good. But one thing I want to throw out there that'd be a nice detail is we don't know how hard we want to shake this thing before they'll start breaking. We don't want them all to break at the same time, so we can just let it play through and then see at what point it does break one. And right now, at frame, about 210-ish, it was strong enough to break one. We definitely know it's strong enough to break them at frame 210. So we were kind of throwing at arbitrary amounts, but now we could be confident if we wanted to. And we are keyframing the follow position, and this goes all the way up to something probably pretty high. That's going all the way up to 55, but we can scroll this to the time of 217 or around 210, doesn't matter super specifically, and then just do one frame forward or backward, and we can see that that's at 48. So there we go, something around 42, 43. Yeah, 40, let's type in 43. We know that's high enough. That is capable of breaking them. So that becomes the new keyframe. It could even get there a little bit quicker if we wanted it to. And now I could undo or rewind. And keep in mind, I did undo that. So I could make that editable again and start running the simulation again. But I don't think it's strictly necessary right now. But the reason for that is, you see, once one chain breaks, they kind of all start breaking because now it's not as caged. This kind of classic thing, if you're watching like a character or a monster chained up, once one chain breaks, the rest are going to be falling off. So let's just see what we end up with here. Stop that from running, and let's just see it in real time. Very nice. Oh, so smooth. Look at, there's no vibration. Everything's like just gravity's holding it. Starts speeding up, brakes, and then starts flinging them all out of the way, and then completely flies out of the scene. Now, I think the vibrate tag's probably a little strong. We don't want it traveling so far to the left and right stylistically, but I'm not too worried stylistically about it. I was worried about the mechanical parts. And look at all of those beautiful, we left them white here so we could tell, but look at these beautiful broken links that we end up with as that runs. We can see that is bent there, still hooked. That one's bent. That one's bent. Some of them are still holding on until finally that snaps those, and you can see those bent as well as they fall away. So yeah, we actually get deformed, accurate breaking links instead of kind of a fake just popping through. Obviously, just letting them pop through, that's a lot quicker. It doesn't take nearly as long, but I think it's worth the extra effort. It's going to sell the effect here very well. I'm very pleased with this. As I'd said in the previous breaking chain tutorial, that it was a bit of an experiment, and I wanted to see if other people had ideas. I had more ideas, so this is a follow-up. So, it makes the last one a little bit redundant, but you know what? It's all the path to perfection, so what are you going to do? This was really fun. I really like these techniques. It's really clean. There's a lot of open-ended experimentation here. The idea of actually breaking these links is just really nice, and being able to run chains relatively quickly, but with all of the accuracy. That is what is so important here. So if you enjoyed this tutorial, please leave a comment, leave a like. That would be great. Otherwise, I have a Patreon set up if this type of stuff is useful to you, if you like the live streams, if you like the tutorials, if you make something cool from this, if you do some client work from this. Support is appreciated, but not necessary. All these tutorials and the Wednesday live stream are going to be free for everybody, always. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next tutorial, and bye-bye, everybody. Okay, moment of truth. Let's see what this does. Hit play. Snap. And okay.
Here is some information about the moment of truth.
Oh my God. Phones. I'm going to go bury these in the backyard. I don't know. I'm just going to rewind. All right. I guess that'll be the blooper.